thank you very much to Shireen and Daniele for the kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. And thank you all for coming early to this presentation. So what I'm going to do is exactly what Daniele said is old-fashioned and you shouldn't do anymore. I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of Gini coefficients across countries. And in fact, as I reflected on his introduction, which was a very good one, I realized just how risky my choice of paper was for this conference, because this, ERF and LIS are both about in-depth, enhanced comparability of data sets. So I described it some years ago in a special issue of the Journal of Economic Inequality, that there is a trade-off between coverage and comparability when you try to harmonize data sets and compare data across a wide range of countries. The broader your coverage, the harder it is to be strictly comparable. And this presentation will definitely be on the coverage side, because we're going to try to talk about the whole world, or as many countries in the world as possible, which means that the degree of real comparability of the microdata underpinning this work is very limited. And so I'm looking forward to your comments, because in this audience in particular, I think you'll be able to criticize a lot of what we're doing in terms of comparability. So without further ado, let me go straight into this. So this is joint work with Christoph Lachner and Annie Sewell, my colleagues at the World Bank. And the title is Inequality Increasing Everywhere. And here's a little overview of what I'll do. I'll provide a brief motivation and context. I'll tell you about the data, how we assembled it, and what data it is. And then I'll present results in three main categories: regional and global averages, country trends, which when we were looking at over 100 countries would be a summary of country trends, not individual country trends. And then a number of robustness checks before I conclude. So by way of motivation, let's start with something that's very well known to everyone in this audience already, and I'm reminded of the fact that the only previous time I was in Egypt was also at an ERF conference, and Branko Milanovic was the other main speaker in that one. And he, of course, talked about global inequality, and this is a picture actually from Bourguignon's work, François Bourguignon's book on the globalization of inequality, where he shows the Wode's Gini coefficient, treating every individual citizen in the world as a person, right? So no boundaries, if you like. There are a lot of assumptions, of course, underpinning the earlier part of this graph, because you didn't have a lot of data for the 1820s. But based on his work with Christian Morisson, which was published in the AER many years ago, they estimated that, there was really a sort of secular increasing trend in income inequality around the world, from a Gini of around 50 in the early 19th century to a Gini of in the mid to upper 60s in 1990, and then there was a decline. Now, unfortunately, right here there is a discontinuity because of the change in the purchasing power parity exchange rates from 1990 to 2005. But if you ignore the level, the trends should have been the same, and you see this decline. Here, the individual distributions are scaled up by GDP per capita. So there's an element of the GDP per capita here as well. And it suggests that from the late 80s to early 90s, there starts to be this, for the first time in recorded data, this decline in global inequality. And Branko Milanovic and Christoph Lachner, in their earlier work on which this graph is based, have also looked at that phenomenon. This graph zooms in at the last period there. This one doesn't use national accounts data. There's no GDP per capita here. It's based only on household survey data. And what you see on the blue line, you see the Gini coefficient for the world again on this scale over here. So you see there from the mid-60s coming down a little bit. That's the same thing we saw in the previous graph. The slope is less pronounced because there isn't this GDP per capita adjustment. But nonetheless, even without the GDP per capita adjustment, there seems to be a decline in the Gini coefficient for the world as a whole. And also, if you use an alternative inequality index, the mean log deviation, the tile L index, which is often used for these kinds of exercises because, unlike the Gini, you can decompose the mean log deviation into a part that's due to inequality within countries and a part that's due to inequality between countries. And that's what you've got here in these bars. These bars, the height of the bar gives you the total mean log deviation, which was 1 in 1988, comes down to around 0.8 or so in 2013. The red part of the bar is within country inequality. The yellow is between country inequality. The heights are the values in mean log deviation, which add up to the total. The numbers on the bars are the shares, so they add up to 100, okay? So a few things to see. First of all, the bulk of inequality in the world was inequality between countries. Inequality between countries accounted for the most of the inequality. Second thing, that is the part of inequality that's been coming down. And it, of course, reflects to a very large extent the rise of populous Asia, right? So this is China, India, other countries in Asia. There's a bit over some periods here of Africa and Latin America as well, but Asia accounts for a lot of that. So there's this convergence across countries that's driving this reduction in between country inequality. And between country inequality as a share of the total fell from 80% to 65% over this period. And that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. What I'm going to be talking about today, we're going to focus on, is the red part, is inequality within countries. Inequality within countries here seemed to be rising whilst inequality between countries was falling, although there's evidence that it stabilizes between 2003 and 2013. A little bit here. This is population weighted, of course, because that's what the mean log deviation does. And what I want to do is look into a little bit more in detail when we look at the countries, as individual countries, what's happening here. This is some sort of average. It's a population weighted average of inequality within countries. And we want to look in this paper in more detail. We're going to zoom in to this red part of the graph, right? And we're going to do that in a context where the conversation globally is shaped by a narrative of increasing inequality, right? So the World Inequality Report, which is produced by our colleagues in Paris at the World Inequality Lab, claimed in 2018, we showed that income inequality has increased in nearly all world regions in recent decades, but at different speeds. And if you look at the conversation in the world's press, in the Financial Times, in The Economist, in the main TV channels, it's all about how inequality is rising everywhere. In fact, I looked at the first sentence of the document for this conference starts with saying, inequality, it's actually worth reading that. Does anybody have that? What's the first sentence? So it has the different ways there as a redeeming feature, but nonetheless, it buys into this narrative that inequality, you know, the rising trends, right? I mean, we know this, right? Inequality is rising everywhere. Well, we'll see that it's not. And some people know this and are careful. So Facundo Alvaredo, who's actually one of the co-authors of this, but in a more scholarly piece with Leo Gasparini in the Handbook of Income Distribution in Volume 2, these are two country mates of Maria Laura, who's here, say the available evidence suggests that on average, the levels of national income inequality in the developing world increased in the 1980s, but declined in the 2000s, 80s and 90s, but declined in the 2000s, okay? The value of the contribution of our paper, we hope, is that it is the first attempt to look at this with a truly global coverage. There are a number of papers that have looked at international comparisons of inequality trends in the last decade or two, but they have been typically regional. So Alvaredo and Gasparini look at more than one region. They look at the developing world. Morelli et al., that's here, look at the developed countries. Lustig et al. Look at Latin America. Andrea Cornia looks at Africa. And Nadia Hassine looks at Arab countries. But nobody tried to look at the world as a whole, and so that's what we try to do in this paper. And to do that, we draw on a data set that's been assembled by the World Bank really for other purposes, primarily for the purpose of measuring poverty, and that's this PovCalNet data that we have. It's the World Bank's repository of microdata on consumption and income distributions. And it is definitely, if you think of what I was describing as a comparability coverage trade-off, it's definitely on the coverage extreme, right? So it has data for more than 140 countries for up to 40 years. Obviously, it doesn't have every point in that cell, but it has data on income and consumption from more than 1,500 household surveys. It's only income and consumption and household size, really, in POV-CalNet. There is other variables are in data that underpins it, but POV-CalNet itself is just really about income and consumption data. For many places, POV-CalNet recently started including data on developed countries as well, but historically it didn't. So we complemented it by using observations from LIS, which account in the end for almost a fifth of the observations that we have here, where we don't have the POV-CalNet themselves, we have them from LIS. The data, of course, countries don't don't carry out surveys every year. Some do, but most don't. And so, you know, we line them up into 6 benchmark years, 1990, 95, 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015. So these 5-year intervals. And we use the nearest survey to that year for each country within a maximum interval of 2 years, plus or minus 2 years. And if they are equidistant, we use the more recent one, okay? Now, there are a number of measurement challenges associated with this. And again, as I said in the beginning, most of you in this audience would point out more measurement problems than we've thought of. But to begin with, we have a mix of income and consumption data, which is really problematic because ideally you really don't want to compare measures of inequality for income and consumption. But on the other hand, because most industrialized countries and Latin American countries collect data on income and not on consumption, and most countries in Africa and Asia, including the Middle East and North Africa, collect data on consumption and much more rarely on income. If you want to have the global coverage, it's kind of difficult to avoid mixing these two. We have some small fixes that I'm going to talk about in the robustness section, but you should be reminded of the fact that there's that very large non-comparability problem to begin with. And in addition to that, the income aggregates and consumption aggregates underpinning each of these are also not harmonized across countries. So there are lots of different ways of treating imputed rent, different ways of treating expenditure on durables. You know, we try to make it as comparable as possible, but you know, particularly in an audience like this, you know, you should take it with considerable amount of salt in terms of the comparability across the consumption and income aggregates over here. Most of it, almost all of it, is based on microdata. Historically, there was a lot of group data in POV-CalNet. Now it's left for only one country. There's only one country in the last year for which we still use group data. So nothing to worry about, right? Except that that one country is China. But, you know, it is one country. And in previous years, it was down to 3 countries in the last few waves. So most of it is microdata. The other big thing, particularly in today's context and where, you know, much of the conversation is being driven by our colleagues in Paris and their emphasis on top incomes, is that these are based on household survey data alone, without administrative data, without tax data. So we know that it captures the top of the distribution very problematically, very poorly. I will, though, at the end, in my robustness discussions, do some comparisons between what we have and what you can find in the World Inequality Database of the World Inequality Lab, to argue that what we find still holds and is mostly consistent with what they find, that the big differences are differences in country coverage. Okay? I will use, despite Daniela's introduction, I will use mostly the Gini coefficient in this presentation, but I will show some data for other indices and some robustness analysis with other indicators. Okay, so first of all, let's see this data set. You know, how big is it? How much of the world are we really talking about? So there you have our 6 years, right? 6 benchmark years. So we range from around 70 to around 140 countries, covering between 70% and 93% of the world. Although the coverage is really pretty good across most regions, less so for sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in the last year, and less so also for the region we're in. Not terrible, but not as high as the other regions which are in the 90s. So as usual with these things, MENA and Africa data are less available or available later than they are in other regions. And these numbers are only as high as they are now because of the ERF, really. Because, 10, 15 years ago, those numbers were much lower. So it's a lot of the work that you've done here that's enabled us to bring it up to that level. The number of countries, and therefore the identity of countries, varies across these benchmark years. Because as I was saying, we're bringing, every time we have a survey for a country, within that 5-year window, the year +2 -2, we bring it in. So you may be worried that we're going to be comparing different samples of countries across these years when we use the full sample. To address that, I'll also show you results for a balanced sample, which is one that has the same countries using the same welfare indicator, other income and consumption, across the 6 years. Obviously, we have much fewer countries then, representing a smaller share of the world's population, but still above 50%. And I'll do that, with 2 versions of the long run, one which begins in 1990, the other which begins in 95, because the one that begins in 95 buys me a whole bunch more countries, okay? And then I'll give you something in between, which are trends between 1990 and 2000, and between 2000 and 2015, where I just insist that we have the same country with the same welfare concept at the beginning and the end, rather than in each particular year. Okay? So this will become clearer as I go by. But for the moment, think of at least a full sample, which has more countries, but the composition of the sample changes slightly from year to year, and a balanced sample, which is smaller, but the same set of countries across. Okay? The trend is somewhere in between, and I'll show you that. So here, in some sense, if you have to leave to your next appointment, this is kind of the main results of the paper in this graph, and then there'll be a lot of elaboration on it. So this is the world average, okay, of Gini coefficients. In blue, forget for the moment the dashed and the solid lines. In blue, we have that average unweighted. In red, we have that average population weighted. The focus of the paper will really be on the blue, because it will be less on what the average person in the world is experiencing. The average person is very heavily Indian or Chinese, right? But on the average country. So let's think for a moment about average countries. Countries as the units. If you take countries as the units, then this is more or less what you see. And for the full sample, which is the solid line here, you see a substantial rise in the 90s, particularly in the early 90s. But then a decline after that, a decline that actually takes it to a point below where it started. Okay? If you use the balanced sample, that's less pronounced, and the decline begins later, begins in 2005 rather than in 1990. This is using the same countries. Now, during this period, focus again on blue and red rather than dashed. During this early period, right, which is rising everywhere, but then clearly during this period, say from 95 to 2005, what happens is a bunch of small countries start having declines in the Gini, while some of the very big ones are still having increases. China, India, and the US in particular. And those therefore drive the red line rising whilst the blue line is falling. But even if you take those population weights, at some point, ultimately in the last 5 years, even the population weighted average of the Ginis is falling. So in some sense, it's not just that inequality isn't rising everywhere. It's actually, on average, in the world, within country inequality, in the last few years, is falling. Now, I don't want to be complacent about this, and towards the end, I'll come back to why we shouldn't be complacent about this at all and treat this as unabashed good news. But just to point to a real disconnect between the conversation you hear in the world's press and what the data are really saying, which is driven by the fact that, as always, when something happens in America, which is where most economists live, suddenly that's happening in the whole world. Right? So in America, inequality is exploding. Elsewhere, it's rising in many places, but not everywhere, evidently. Okay. All right. So now here, that main line, as I said, I'm going to now focus a lot on the unweighted, but you should remember that for the weighted sample, the results are weaker and later. but there is a decline eventually as well. So if we now here I have the same blue line that I had before on the left, and on the right I have that line, the mean, the median, and the 10th and the 90th percentile. So this is trying to show you a little bit of the distribution of Gini coefficients around the world. So it's a distribution of inequality statistics, the distribution of Gini coefficients around the world, just showing you the median, the mean, and the 10th and the 90th percentiles. Two things to note. First of all, here the scales change completely, right? So when you look at a scale that allows you to compare the range of inequality around the world, that decline looks suddenly much, much smaller. In other words, whatever changes we're talking about in this average inequality within countries around the world, relative to the variance in inequality levels that exists in the world is small. The difference between countries is still much greater than the changes over time. Point one. Point two, that distribution seems to be converging a little bit. So the gap between the 90th and the 10th percentile is falling. The countries of higher inequality have had more of a decline in inequality than countries with low inequality. Martin Ravallion many years ago postulated this hypothesis of inequality convergence, and when he wrote it, he was running a regression, so he was effectively talking about what other people call beta convergence. This is sigma convergence. This is looking at at the distribution of inequality as a whole, and you do see sigma convergence in inequality around the world, and you understand why when you look at it across regions. So these are regional averages now. And again, they look here, the trends look less impressive because we are in this scale, right? We are in the big international scale, so changes don't look as marked. But nonetheless, you see Latin America, the region that has the highest levels of inequality, with a pretty marked decline from 2000 to 2015. In sub-Saharan Africa, there was a decline earlier, with a little bit of an increase later. East Asia, there's quite a substantial decline towards the end. The region we're in, MENA, had this decline in inequality between 2000 and 2010, which I remember was very vexing in the last workshop, the one I came to in 2012, because the idea was rising inequality was somehow behind the Arab Spring and the protests of 2011 and so on. And it turns out when we looked at the data that inequality had been declining, which suggests that inequality may well have been behind those protests, but not the inequality that we capture through these simple numbers, which points again to Daniela's point that actually we probably have to look much deeper than these numbers to understand what was going on. And at that time, I was talking about inequality of opportunity as one of the possible channels. The way we measured that didn't work to explain things very much either. But that just points, I think, to the shortcomings of some of these indicators and the data that underpins them. More recently, there has been a bit of an increase in inequality in MENA as well. And in ECA, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, you have a big rise during the transition from socialism. So after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, you see a big increase, and then stability and actually a bit of a decline after that. This brings back the balance samples. So it's a point I already made earlier about the balance samples, but here I have balance samples beginning at different points. I have a balance sample beginning in 1990 and one beginning in 95, just to show basically that once again, although there may be some disagreements from the balanced and the unbalanced sample, on the whole there is a decline, and the two samples agree from about 2000, 2005 onwards. Whichever composition you see of these unweighted averages is having a decline in inequality. This is robust to looking at other measures. So here's the mean log deviation, where you see again so one of these should be the full sample. So the dotted line is the unbalanced sample, the full sample. The other two are balanced samples beginning at different points. And here's the income share of the top 10%. So trying to enter into the dialogue with Paris a little bit and looking only at the top. Again, for the top 10%, you see the same decline in inequality beginning around 2000, 2005, or even earlier if you look at the full sample. The graph of the full sample also has the inflection point there in 1995. So this was showing you global and regional trends, or trends in global and regional averages of inequality, whether by the Gini coefficient or these other indicators, to show you that that global number was falling over time. Now we want to look a little bit at the number of countries that underpin that average and see the heterogeneity in their behavior. So here I start with the long run, so the whole period I have, 1990 to 2015, or a slightly shorter period beginning in 95 to get more countries. And there are three columns here. The first column has countries where the Gini is rising by more than 1 percentage point. The downward arrow is countries where the Gini is falling by more than 1 percentage point. And in between, you have countries where the changes are small. The changes are between plus and minus 1%. This is a rough alternative to using standard errors. It's an idea to getting at confidence. And the reason we don't use proper standard errors is that we have no way of knowing the full complexity of sampling design over here, in terms of stratification and sampling and so on. So we would actually get those standard errors wrong. So we follow in this Alvaredo and Gasparini, who have the same problem, and focus on this, use this 1% as a limit of what's going on, okay? So, in the first, if you look at the, oops. So I don't know what oh, there it is. If you look at the long run, you actually, have, the number of countries that are rising here, beginning in 1990, is more than the number of countries that are falling. Okay, if you begin in 95, that changes, and that, of course, is consistent with what we just saw here, which is that between 90 and 95, there were very big increases. So the number of countries that are changing there is different. If you look at the long run, there were still more countries where the Gini was rising than where it was falling. The average Gini is unchanged over that period, okay? If you begin in 95, then there's a decline in the average Gini, and there are more countries where the Gini is falling. So that suggests that we should try and split that period into the 90s and the period after the 90s, which is what we do here. And there, quite clearly, and I think here I have some, so quite clearly in terms of the numbers of countries, in the 1990s, you had countries where the Gini was falling, 20 of them, but there were more countries where the Gini was rising. That gets reversed in the second period. In the 2000s, of the 87 countries that we have, there are 20 countries where we're kind of unsure, but there are 45 countries where the Gini was falling by more than 1 point, and 22 where it was rising by more than 1 point. So our headline, media number here is that for each country where inequality was rising in the 2000s, there were 2 where it was falling, okay? And the overall Gini, the average Gini fell by about 2 points in that second period, okay? So now let's do some robustness checks. So we'll do 2 kinds of things. Something very simple around this income and consumption issue, the fact that we have income and consumption numbers that I mentioned before. And then something about using different data sets. So POV-CalNet is one data set that we've augmented with 20% of observations from LIS. But there are a number of other data sets out there. CEPAL has a data set, the equivalent of ESQA for Latin America has a data set for Latin America. Eurostat, of course, has data for Europe. There is the LIS data that you know well. OECD has a data set. CEDLAC, which is a partnership between the World Bank and the University of La Plata in Argentina, has a different data set from CEPAL for Latin America. There is the SWID, the standardized World Income Inequality Database, which uses imputations to fill out a number of gaps. There is the WIID of UNU-WIDER. There is now the World Inequality Database of the Paris group, of the World Inequality Lab. So what if you use these other data sets? There are differences. We had this special issue of the Journal of Economic Inequality that I co-edited with Nora Lustig, where we try to look at these. Mostly they're consistent, but there are differences between these data sets. So I want to show you that the trends I've identified here and shown you do not change, really, when you look at these other data sets. And I'll look at the WID, which is the most different, because it has top incomes. It has tax data in it. I'll look at that in more detail at the end, okay? So first of all, when you're looking across countries, the simplest way for controlling, for adjusting for the fact that there's more inequality in income distributions than in consumption distributions is to take some average observed difference in the Gini coefficients for countries that measure both income and consumption and apply them elsewhere. We have two such sources. One is this 0.861 factor that says for Latin American countries that collect the data on both income and consumption, the Ginis for the same year for consumption were 86% of the income Ginis. Savings rise with income, right? So there's more inequality in an income distribution than there is in a consumption distribution. That's more or less universal. How much less? Well, in Latin America, it was 86%, so 14% less. We did the same thing for Europe and Central Asia countries for a sample that we had, and we found a number of 83.2%. So same level of magnitude. Now, if you do this, obviously, you're not going to change the trends because you're just using a scale. But you might say, well, because your full sample, the composition is changing, maybe that would make some sort of difference. So we do that simple exercise. These are the rescaled income Ginis. And if you rescale all the income Ginis in our sample so that they look like consumption Ginis, the levels, of course, of inequality are lower, but the trends don't change. This is unsurprising given the type of adjustment you're making, and we don't claim this is an ideal adjustment. Ideally, there is no way in which, so if you look at each particular country, the income and consumption distributions will differ in various different ways. But for an exercise of comparing a lot of countries, this is the best we could do, and it suggests that income and consumption differences do not account for this pattern, right? The pattern survives for that. Now, what are the differences in the levels of Gini coefficients across these different data sets that I described? These are metadata sets. These are compilations of inequality numbers, much like POV-CalNet and LIS. The first thing to notice is that, so these numbers here, when you look at this table, these numbers are Gini points. So this number here says that the Ginis in POV-CalNet for the 11 countries that are also in Eurostat in 1995 are 2.5 points higher in POV-CalNet. 2.5 points, okay? So that's what these numbers are. So they are Gini points. They are the difference between the number of countries that we can compare in each data set and POV-CalNet for that particular year. These are the same surveys, So two things to take away from this table. The level differences are relatively small. They are mostly positive. They are mostly positive because POV-CalNet uses per capita income. And a whole bunch of these other data sets use some equivalent scale, which adjusts for the economies of scale within the household. And we know that those economies of scale reduce inequality a little bit. So LIS, for example, uses that if you take it from the LIS figures, from the published statistics. And by the way, here we're using the LIS the key figures, the published statistics. When we bring the LIS data into our own sample, we use the microdata, and so we have the per capita. We have it in per capita terms as well. Okay. One exception here is CEPAL, where the numbers are negative. So CEPAL has higher Gini's than POVCALNet. The reason for that is that CEPAL makes adjustments to try and impute some of the differences between national account aggregates and household survey aggregates into there. So for example, capital incomes are missing in household surveys. And CEPAL historically, they stopped doing this by the way, but historically they used to just divide that proportionately to earned income in the top 20% only. So of course they make the distribution higher, right? So level differences are typically small and we can account for them in some way. Now what happens if we try and replace, so if we try and use these other data sets? Now one problem with this is that these other data sets are not global, typically, right? On the whole, except for the SWID and the WID, they're not global. And so you can't just use that data set. So what we did is we started with POVCALNet, and here's the data for POVCALNet, right? And then we replaced each point that we could replace, each observation that we could replace with something from another survey, and we did it in order. First, we took all the surveys that we had, years that we had for which Eurostat, so country year cells that we had, for which there was also an Eurostat number, and we replaced it with the Eurostat number. Then we took the ones for which we had a number, Eurostat didn't, but LIS did. And then SEDLAC, and then WID, in that order of preference. So in the end, we replaced 40% of our data with Gini coefficient estimates coming from other data sets, okay? And you get then the orange line, okay? Which suggests that if you used as much of other data sets as possible instead of ours, you'd get a picture very, very close to what we have as well. So it's not really, which is unsurprising given that the level differences were not that large, right? So this is meant to suggest robustness of this conclusion that inequality is not rising, and in fact, the unweighted average of within country inequality since 1995, you know, and if you use the balanced sample a little later, and if you use the weighted sample even later, but it's actually been declining, that is robust to using data sets that are alternative to POVCALNet. Another way of looking at that robustness is to compare country trends again. So here, the two arrows and the one arrow, the two arrows are where in both, so these are comparisons. So this is in POVCALNet, this gives you the benchmark. So this is 2000 to 2015. There are 87 countries. That's the number I gave you earlier, right? For each country where inequality was rising, there are two countries in which inequality was falling. Now the other rows in this table have comparisons between POVCALNet and some other survey. Here we use only the global ones, so SWID in the second row, the UNU-wide or WID in the third row, and then combinations of Eurostat, LIS, and SEDLAC, Eurostat, LIS, SEDLAC, and WID, which is the one I showed you in the graph before. These are the number of countries for which either both data sets say that it's rising by more than 1%, or one says it's rising by more than 1% and the other says it's within the 1% band. Analogously for the declining ones, and in between are the ones where both data sets say it's in the 1% margin. So where we really worry is where one data set says it's rising by more than 1% and the other says it's falling by more than 1%. That would suggest we really don't know what's going on in that country, and that's the number of those countries. So the message is it's zero, except with SWID, which uses these imputations, and you know, read Stephen Jenkins's paper in the World, in the Journal of Economic Inequality on why that's probably not a good idea. But on the whole, the idea that comes from here is one of robustness. I mean, on the whole, there is agreement between all these data sets. this is looking within a little bit what was here, right? Okay. Now, the real question that you're probably all asking yourselves is, the reason the conversation has been about increasing inequality everywhere is these top incomes, right? Piketty and Size, and then Alvaredo, Atkinson, and Piketty, and a number of different papers have said, look, these surveys are missing the top. When we add the top in, things look different. And indeed they do. I mean, they're quite right about that. We knew that these surveys were missing the top, right? There's a paper by Ravalion and Korinek and Mistian years ago that already pointed to that. But the Paris group has made an amazing contribution by actually bringing the tax data in and using it. Now, we're now going to try and compare it a little bit with the WID, the Paris data set. And with that, I'm going to conclude. So here is a comparison between, much as I did before for the other data sets. Now I'm going to do it with the World Income Database of Paris. Now the problem is they have a much smaller number of surveys or countries. They are often actually just tax data, and in some cases they're combinations of surveys and tax data. Of the 87 countries that we have able to say something in this period, in the latter period, there are 31 that they also have, okay? And here it's all WID, so the difference is between using 10% or 1%, and the high quality sample is the one that the Paris group itself says is their high quality sample. Let's focus on the row where there are the most disagreements. You can see that here there are more disagreements than before. The row where there are more disagreements is the 10% POV-CALNET versus WID. There are 4 countries where there's a disagreement. Note, first of all, that 4 out of 31 is still 13%. So that says that for these 31 countries that we have and they have in this period, POV-CALNET and WID agree in 27 countries and disagree in 4 countries. Okay? So how come they find that inequality is rising in most places and we find that inequality is falling in most places? Well, that's because where we have 20 countries where inequality is rising, they have 15. That's 75% of what we have. But where we have 41 countries where inequality is falling, they have 7. Okay? Because inequality is falling primarily in poorer countries where they haven't got the tax data yet and are not able to say. Now, that is not to say that we know that inequality is falling once you've got those top 1%. We don't know that. Okay? But if we looked at our subsample of the 31, if we looked only at the countries for which they have data, we would also find that inequality was rising in most countries. We find it's rising in 15 versus 7 of the countries they have. The problem is that we have another 34 countries that they don't, okay? Again, we don't know that it's falling if we had the 1% for those countries. But I want to say, of these 4 countries here where there are disagreements, it's not like we find that they're falling and they find that they're rising. Those 4 countries, in 2 of them, they find that it's rising, and we find that it's falling. Those are Brazil and Poland. And in 2, we find that it's rising, and they find that it's falling, which is Russia and Turkey. Okay. Yeah, this is just to highlight, again, why that is. This is the POV-CALNET samples. These are the coverage of countries. So, you know, Eastern Europe, and the industrialized countries together account for 42% of our sample, but 84% of their sample. That's an inequality there has mostly been rising. Okay. So, to conclude, we already knew from the work of Bourguignon and others, and Milanovic and Lachner, that global inequality is obviously still very, very high, but it's been declining during this century. And this is driven primarily by a decline in inequality between countries. However, whereas we used to say inequality within countries has continued to rise, our data suggests that inequality within countries has also appeared to begin falling, at least after 2000. Yeah? For some measures in 95, for some measures in 2005, but after 2000 it started falling. Indeed, and there's our media headline there, between 2000 and 2015, for every country that we have data on where the Gini index rose by more than 1 percentage point, there are 2 countries where it fell by more than 1 percentage point. This trend is driven primarily by developing countries, Latin America in particular, but East Asia and parts of Africa as well. The trends are robust to basic adjustments for income and consumption differences. They are robust to population weights, though not the timing. The timing changes, right? The decline of population weights is later. It's there for alternative measures, including the share of top 10%, and it's robust to using alternative data sets as well. The width sample shows the opposite result for both survey and top corrected data, but it's because the rich countries are overrepresented in that sample. On the common sample, there are only 4 disagreements, and as I said, they go they go both ways. Some important caveats before I end. First of all, there are, as you guys in this room are highly qualified to point out, there are huge measurement issues here. The comparability of consumption and income aggregates across these countries leaves much to be desired. Although there is basic, we use the same equivalence scales and we treat extreme values in the same way, but other than that, there are big issues. Top incomes remain a huge concern, right? There's also a concern that this period that we've been looking at was marked by the global financial crisis in 2008 to 2011 or whatever. There was a commodity price boom in LAC. There's no guarantee here, of course, that this will continue. I'm not saying inequality is going to keep falling. In fact, in Latin America, where it was falling quite a bit over this period, in many countries it has already stopped falling. So there are reasons to believe that that decline may change. I'm not talking about the future, I'm talking about the past. Okay? And then, if you're worried about what this means for people, remember that absolute inequality, so these here are growth incidence curves, right? So this is a country, in Maria Laura's honor, this is Argentina, 2004 to 2013. That's the growth incidence curve. That's the percentage point growth at each percentile. That downward sloping growth incidence curve means inequality is falling. The Gini coefficient is falling. The poor are getting more percentage growth than the rich. This is the differences in absolute pesos. Even though the rich are getting a much lower proportion of a big number is a bigger number. So absolute inequality keeps rising everywhere throughout this whole period. Okay? So let's not forget that, and there's no sense of complacency here about these numbers. But that said, because it really annoys me every time I read now that inequality is rising everywhere, inequality is not rising everywhere. It's been falling in a number of countries. Most of those are developing since the 2000s. At least in some cases, this may reflect policy choices. So the agenda going forward is to try to understand why that's been happening. So thank you very much.